David sat quietly in the passenger seat of the car, his hands resting on his lap. His fingers trembled slightly, but he tried to hide it. He didn't want Michael, his son, to see how nervous he was. The car moved smoothly along the road, but David felt as if he were being taken somewhere far, far away from everything he had ever known. The morning had started like any other. David had woken up early, just like he always did, and made himself a cup of tea. He had looked around his small house, the place he had lived in for so many years. The walls were filled with memories. There were pictures of his late wife, the woman he had loved dearly. There were also pictures of Michael, from the time he was a little boy to the day he graduated. Michael wasn't his son by blood, but David had never thought of him as anything less. He had adopted Michael when he was just 7 years old, a scared little boy with big, sad eyes. Over the years, they had become more than just father and son. They had become best friends. But now, as David sat in the car, he felt like that bond was about to break. For the past few weeks, Michael had been acting differently. He had started talking about David's health, about how living alone wasn't safe anymore. At first, David had laughed it off, saying he was strong and could take care of himself. But then, Michael had started making phone calls in private. He had visited David's house more often, looking around, cleaning things, and taking old clothes out of the closet. David hadn't thought much of it at first, but deep inside, a fear had started growing. And today, that fear had become real. That morning, Michael had arrived with a smile, saying, "Dad, let's go for a drive." His voice had been cheerful, but David could see something behind his eyes, something he wasn't saying. Now, as they drove past familiar streets, David felt like each turn was taking him further away from his home, from his memories, from his life. He had heard stories before, stories of elderly people being sent to nursing homes, places where they were taken care of, but where they felt lonely. Was that what Michael was planning? David wanted to ask, but his throat felt dry. He glanced at Michael, who was focused on the road, humming a soft tune. He didn't look sad or guilty. In fact, he looked peaceful. But why? The car moved past the town, and soon they were on an open road surrounded by trees. David clenched his hands together. Maybe it was better not to ask. Maybe he already knew the answer. He took a deep breath and stared out of the window, wondering if this was the last time he would ever see the world as a free man. As the car moved steadily down the road, David's mind drifted back to the past. Memories, like old photographs, filled his thoughts. He remembered the first time he had seen Michael, just a small boy sitting alone on a wooden bench at the orphanage. His clothes were too big for his tiny frame, and his eyes held a sadness that no child should ever have. David had not planned to adopt a child that day. He and his wife, Margaret, had simply gone to visit the orphanage to donate some clothes and food. But something about the boy had touched his heart. He had watched as the other children played together, laughing and shouting, while Michael sat quietly, his little hands folded in his lap. Margaret had noticed too. She had leaned in close and whispered, "That boy needs a home." And just like that, their lives had changed forever. Bringing Michael home had not been easy. He had been shy at first, barely speaking, as if he was afraid that any happiness he felt would be taken away. But David and Margaret had been patient. They had given him love, warmth, and a place to belong. Slowly, Michael had started to trust them. He had begun to smile more, to talk more, and eventually to laugh. David remembered the first time Michael had called him Dad. It had been almost a year after they had adopted him. He had been playing outside when he had fallen and scraped his knee. David had rushed to help, and in between his tears, Michael had whispered, "Dad, it hurts." David had felt his heart swell with love. From that moment on, he had promised himself that he would always protect this boy, no matter what. Years passed, and Michael grew into a smart, kind-hearted young man. He had worked hard in school, always trying his best. David and Margaret had been proud of him. When Margaret passed away, Michael had been David's greatest support. He had stayed by his side, making sure he never felt alone. Now, sitting in the car, David wondered how things had changed so much. The little boy who had once needed him was now all grown up. But had David become a burden to him? He thought about the last few months. He had started to feel weaker, his legs not as strong as they used to be. He sometimes forgot small things, where he had left his glasses, what day it was. Maybe Michael had noticed. Maybe he thought David couldn't take care of himself anymore. David swallowed hard. He had never been afraid of getting old, but he had always been afraid of being unwanted. He glanced at Michael, who was still driving, a calm expression on his face. David wanted to ask him, wanted to hear him say that he wasn't taking him to a nursing home. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, he just sat there, lost in the memories of a life he had given to his son, unsure of what the future would now give back to him. As the car continued down the road, David's heart grew heavier. The silence between him and Michael felt louder than words. He wanted to believe his son wouldn't send him away. But everything Michael had done in the past few weeks told a different story. David had noticed the small things first. Michael had started visiting more often, checking on him like he was a fragile object that might break at any moment. "Dad, did you eat today? Dad, are you feeling okay? Maybe I should stay the night." At first, David had appreciated it. He had thought his son was just being caring. But then, other things had started happening. One afternoon, Michael had come over and quietly started sorting through David's old things. He had taken clothes out of the closet, folded them neatly, and packed some of them in bags. "Just making space," he had said with a smile. Then there were the phone calls. David had heard him talking in the next room, his voice low but serious. He had caught words like arrangements, long-term care, and safety. When David had asked who he was talking to, Michael had simply said, "Just handling some things, Dad." Handling what? And then, just a week ago, Michael had brought him a stack of papers. "Just some documents, Dad. I need you to sign them." David had read through them slowly. Some of the papers were about his medical records, some were about his house. One of them was a consent form for something. He hadn't understood everything. But Michael had reassured him, saying, "It's just to make things easier for me to help you." David had signed them. He had trusted his son. But now, as he sat in the car, he wondered, had he unknowingly agreed to be sent away? His grip tightened on his knee. He had always been independent, always taken care of himself. He wasn't weak. He wasn't useless. But what if Michael saw him differently now? What if he thought David was too old to live alone? Too much trouble to take care of? He swallowed hard. Maybe he should have seen this coming. He had heard stories before. Stories of elderly people who had worked hard all their lives, raised their children with love, only to be sent to a place where strangers would care for them in their final years. Had he become one of those stories? He turned to look at Michael, trying to read his face. His son's eyes were focused on the road, calm and steady. He didn't look guilty or sad. If anything, he looked content. David's heart ached. Maybe Michael thought he was doing the right thing. Maybe he believed David would be happier in a home where nurses could watch over him. But David didn't want that. He wanted to stay in his own home, with his memories. He wanted to wake up in his own bed, sit in his old chair by the window, drink tea from the same cup he had used for years. He wanted to be where he belonged. But now, he wasn't sure if that choice was still his to make. David kept his eyes on the road, watching as the familiar sights of his town slowly disappeared behind them. The houses, the small grocery store where he had bought bread for years, the park where he and Michael had once played when he was a little boy, all of it was fading away as they drove further. His heart felt heavier with every mile. He wanted to ask where they were going, but a part of him was afraid of the answer. Then something strange happened. David had spent the last few days memorizing the route to the nursing home he believed Michael was taking him to. He had checked a map, traced the roads with his finger, and prepared himself for what was coming. But now, as he looked around, he realized they weren't going in that direction. The turn they were supposed to take, Michael had just passed it. David frowned. He knew this road well, but it didn't lead to any nursing home. It led somewhere else. Confused, he turned to Michael. "Son, where exactly are we going?" His voice was calm, but there was a nervous edge to it. Michael didn't look at him. He simply smiled and said, "You'll see, Dad. Just trust me." Trust him. David had trusted Michael his whole life, but right now, that answer wasn't enough. He needed to know. He needed to be sure. "Michael," David said more firmly, I thought we were going to." He couldn't even bring himself to say the words nursing home. The thought alone made his chest feel tight. Michael finally turned to look at him for a brief second before focusing back on the road. "I know what you're thinking, Dad," he said, his voice warm and steady. "But I promise, it's not what you think." Not what he thought. Then what was it? David's hands loosened slightly, but his mind was still racing. He didn't know whether to feel relieved or more confused. They drove for another 15 minutes, the road lined with tall trees and quiet houses. It was peaceful here, almost too peaceful. The sun was setting, painting the sky with soft orange and pink colors. Then Michael slowed the car and turned onto a quiet street. The houses were small but well kept, with neatly trimmed lawns and flower beds filled with bright colors. It was a beautiful neighborhood, but David had never been here before. Michael pulled the car into the driveway of a single-story house with a light blue roof. He put the car in park and turned to his father with a gentle smile. "Dad," he said softly, "we're home." David blinked, staring at the house in front of him. Home. This wasn't his house. This wasn't where he had lived for years. His heart pounded. What was Michael talking about? Slowly, David unbuckled his seatbelt and stepped out of the car, his legs feeling shaky. He stared at the house, confused, unsure. And then his eyes landed on the small wooden sign near the front door. The words carved into it made his breath catch in his throat. Dad's new home. David felt the world shift beneath his feet. His mind struggled to make sense of it. This wasn't the nursing home he had feared. This wasn't a place filled with strangers, white walls, and quiet hallways. This was a house, a real house, and not just any house, one that felt warm, welcoming. But why? He turned to Michael, his voice unsteady. "Michael, what is this?" Michael smiled, his eyes filled with something David couldn't quite understand yet. "Come inside, Dad," he said gently. "Let me show you." Still confused, David followed his son up the small porch steps. Michael reached for the door handle and pushed it open. The moment David stepped inside, he stopped in his tracks. The living room was bright and cozy. Sunlight poured in through the large windows, casting a golden glow across the soft brown couch. A familiar knitted blanket was draped over the armrest, the same one David's late wife, Margaret, had made years ago. His old wooden rocking chair sat by the window, just like it had in his previous home. The scent of freshly brewed tea lingered in the air. David's breath caught in his throat. His eyes moved slowly around the room. The bookshelf in the corner was filled with his favorite novels, the ones he had read over and over again. A small wooden table held a picture frame, the same one he had kept on his nightstand for years. It was a photo of him, Margaret, and a young Michael, all smiling together. Everything here felt familiar. Everything here felt like home. David turned to Michael, his voice barely a whisper. How did you do this?" Michael's smile grew wider. "I've been planning this for months, Dad," he said. "I knew you wouldn't want to leave your home, but I also knew you couldn't live alone anymore. So I found this place, a house that's safe for you, close to me, where you won't be alone." David's eyes filled with tears. He had spent so many days fearing that Michael was sending him away, that he had become a burden. But now, standing in this house, he realized how wrong he had been. Michael hadn't abandoned him. Michael had built him a new home. David swallowed hard, his heart pounding. He walked further inside, his fingers brushing over the furniture, the walls, the memories carefully placed in every corner. This wasn't just a house. This was love. He turned back to his son, his voice shaking with emotion. "You did all of this for me." Michael nodded, stepping closer. "Of course, Dad. You took care of me when I needed you. Now it's my turn." David felt a tear slip down his cheek. For the first time in weeks, the fear that had weighed on his heart disappeared. David sat down slowly on the soft brown couch, still trying to understand everything. His hands rested on his knees as he looked around the room. Every corner of the house felt familiar, like a piece of his old life had been carefully placed here. Michael sat beside him, watching him closely. "Do you like it, Dad?" he asked gently. David opened his mouth to speak but couldn't find the right words. He had spent so many days fearing that Michael would send him away to a place where he would be just another old man waiting for time to pass. But instead, his son had given him something he never expected, another chance to feel at home. He finally managed to whisper, "It's beautiful." Michael smiled. "I wanted this to feel just like your old house, so I brought everything you love here." He pointed toward the bookshelf. "Your books." Then to the rocking chair. "Your favorite seat." Then to the small kitchen visible from where they sat. "I even made sure we stocked up on your favorite tea." David's eyes moved slowly over each thing. He saw the little flower pot that had sat on his old kitchen window. He saw the handmade rug that Margaret had woven so many years ago. He even saw his old radio, the one he used to listen to every morning while drinking tea. Tears welled up in his eyes. He had been so wrong about Michael. He took a deep breath and finally asked, "But why, son? Why go through all this trouble?" Michael leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Because I love you, Dad," he said, his voice steady but full of emotion. "I know you've been worried these past few weeks. I saw it in your eyes. You thought I was going to send you to a nursing home." David lowered his gaze, feeling ashamed. "I did," he admitted softly. Michael reached out and took his father's hands in his own. "I would never do that to you, Dad. Never." His grip was warm, firm, reassuring. "You gave me a home when I had no one. You raised me, loved me, and made me the man I am today. How could I ever abandon you?" David looked into his son's eyes and saw nothing but love. Michael continued, "I knew you couldn't live alone anymore, but I also knew you didn't want to leave everything behind. So I found this house, close to my own, and made it yours." He smiled softly. "This way, you'll always have your space, your memories, and everything you love, but you'll also never be alone." David's heart swelled with emotion. The fear, the doubt, the sadness he had been carrying for so long. Suddenly, it was gone. He squeezed Michael's hands and nodded. "Thank you, son." His voice cracked with emotion. "Thank you for not giving up on me." Michael chuckled lightly. "Never, Dad. You're stuck with me." For the first time in a long while, David felt truly at peace. David leaned back into the couch, his heart still full of emotions. He glanced around the room once more, taking in every little detail. The warmth of the house, the soft glow of the lamps, and the scent of freshly brewed tea. It all felt like home. But there was still one question in his mind. He turned to Michael, his voice gentle but curious. "Son, when did you plan all of this?" Michael smiled, leaning back as well. "It started a few months ago, Dad," he said. "I knew you were struggling on your own, even though you never said it out loud." David lowered his gaze. It was true. Over the past year, simple things had become harder for him. Climbing the stairs had felt like a mountain. Cooking had become tiring. Even remembering small things had started to slip from his mind. But he had never complained. He had never asked for help. Michael continued, I didn't want to make you feel like you were losing your independence. I didn't want you to think that I was taking away your home. So, I looked for another way." David listened carefully, feeling the depth of his son's love with every word. "I found this house a few months ago," Michael said. "It's close to mine, safe and easy to manage. I wanted to make sure you had everything you needed here. That's why I brought your things, the ones that mean the most to you." David smiled softly. His son had thought of everything. But Michael added, "I also knew you might not agree right away. That's why I didn't tell you earlier. I wanted to show you first." David let out a small chuckle. "You were right. If you had told me, I might have refused." Michael laughed too. "I know, Dad. You're stubborn." David shook his head, a warm feeling spreading through his chest. His son truly knew him. Just then, Michael stood up. "Come on, Dad," he said, reaching out his hand. "Let me show you the rest of the house." David took his hand and stood up slowly. Together, they walked through the rooms. The kitchen was bright and welcoming. On the counter, a small jar of cookies sat next to a steaming pot of tea. Michael smiled. "I made your favorite tea before we left," he said. David felt a lump in his throat. His son had thought of even the smallest details. They walked into the bedroom next. David's old bed was there, covered with the same soft blanket he had used for years. His nightstand had the same lamp, the same books, and even the same small alarm clock he had used for decades. David ran his fingers over the wooden frame of the bed. This wasn't just a house. It was a continuation of his life. Michael placed a hand on his shoulder. "Dad, this is your home now," he said, "and I'll always be right next door." David turned to him, his eyes shining with gratitude. "I don't know how to thank you, son." Michael smiled. "Just be happy, Dad. That's all I want." And for the first time, in a long time, David felt truly happy. That evening, David sat on the porch of his new home, watching the golden sun slowly disappear behind the trees. A gentle breeze blew through the air, rustling the leaves. The world felt calm, peaceful, something he hadn't felt in a long time. Michael sat beside him, holding 2 cups of tea. He handed one to David, who took it with a small smile. The tea was warm, just the way he liked it. He took a slow sip, letting the familiar taste comfort him. For a while, they sat in silence, enjoying the quiet moment. Then, David spoke. "You know, son, I was really scared." Michael turned to him, his eyes full of concern. "Scared of what, Dad?" David sighed, looking down at his cup. I thought you were going to leave me in a nursing home." His voice was soft, but there was a weight to his words. "I thought I had become a burden to you." Michael's face fell. He reached over and placed a hand on David's shoulder. "Dad, you could never be a burden to me." His voice was firm, full of love. "You are my father. You raised me, gave me everything. How could I ever think of leaving you alone?" David swallowed hard, feeling his chest tighten with emotion. "I just didn't want to lose my home," he admitted. Michael smiled gently. "I know, Dad. That's why I did everything I could to make this place feel just like home for you." He gestured toward the house. "Your things, your memories, they're all here. And most importantly, I'm here. You're not alone." David looked at his son, truly seeing him for the first time in a long while. Michael wasn't the little boy who used to hold his hand while crossing the street. He wasn't the teenager who once dreamed of moving to a big city. He was a man now, a good man, a son who had given his father the greatest gift, love and care. David's eyes filled with tears, but he quickly blinked them away. He wasn't ashamed of them, but he didn't want Michael to worry. Instead, he reached out and gently patted his son's hand. "You're a good man, Michael," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Your mother would be so proud of you." Michael's eyes softened. "I hope so," he whispered. "Everything I do, Dad, is because of what you and Mom taught me. Family takes care of each other." Always. David smiled, his heart swelling with pride. He had spent his life raising Michael, teaching him right from wrong, guiding him toward kindness and responsibility. And now, in his old age, that same kindness was being given back to him. As the last bit of sunlight faded, Michael stood up. "Come inside, Dad. It's getting late." David nodded and slowly stood. Before heading inside, he took one last look at the sky. For the first time in a long while, he felt at peace. He wasn't just living in a house. That night, David lay in his bed, staring at the ceiling. The room was quiet except for the soft ticking of his old alarm clock on the nightstand. It was strange. He was in a different house, in a different room, but somehow he felt at home. The bed was just like his old one. The blanket smelled like fresh laundry, and the soft glow of the lamp beside him gave a comforting warmth to the room. But more than that, there was something else that made this place feel right. Michael. His son had done everything to make sure he was safe, comfortable, and happy. David had spent weeks worrying, thinking he was being sent away, only to realize that Michael had been planning something beautiful all along. A small smile formed on his lips. He had raised a good son. Just then, there was a gentle knock on the door. "Dad." Michael's voice was soft. David turned his head. "Come in, son." Michael pushed the door open and stepped inside. He was holding a small plate with 2 biscuits and a cup of warm milk. "I thought you might like a little snack before bed," he said with a smile. David chuckled as he sat up. "You still remember, huh?" Michael grinned. "Of course. Every night when I was a kid, you used to bring me biscuits and milk before bed. You said it would help me sleep better." David's heart warmed at the memory. He had always made sure Michael went to bed feeling safe and loved. And now here was his son doing the same for him. Michael placed the plate and cup on the nightstand. "Are you comfortable, Dad? Do you need anything?" David shook his head. "No, son. I have everything I need." He took a sip of the milk and let out a satisfied sigh. "This reminds me of your mother," he said. "She always made sure we had something warm before bed." Michael sat at the edge of the bed. "I miss her, Dad." David placed a gentle hand on his son's. "Me too, but I know she's watching over us. And if she could see you right now, she'd be so proud." Michael's eyes glistened for a moment, but he quickly smiled. "She taught me well. You both did." For a while, they sat there in comfortable silence. The night felt peaceful, filled with love and understanding. Then Michael stood up and patted his father's shoulder. "All right, Dad. Get some rest. Tomorrow, I'll take you to the park. The one you used to take me to when I was little." David's eyes lit up. "I'd love that." Michael smiled. "Good night, Dad." David watched as his son walked to the door. Just before stepping out, Michael turned off the lamp, leaving the room in a gentle darkness. As David lay back down, he felt a deep sense of peace. The next morning, David woke up feeling rested and peaceful. Sunlight streamed through the curtains, filling the room with a soft golden glow. For the first time in a long time, he felt no fear, no worry, only warmth and happiness. As he sat up in bed, the smell of freshly brewed tea and toasted bread filled the air. A small smile formed on his lips. He knew exactly who was behind it. Slowly, he got out of bed, put on his slippers, and made his way to the kitchen. There he found Michael setting the table. 2 plates, 2 cups of tea, and a small dish of butter and jam, just the way David had always liked it. "Good morning, Dad," Michael greeted with a bright smile. David chuckled as he pulled out a chair. "You really didn't have to do all this, son." Michael sat down across from him. "I wanted to. Besides, you took care of me all my life. Now it's my turn." David shook his head in amazement. "I still can't believe all of this, Michael. This house, everything you've done. You didn't just give me a place to live. You gave me a home." Michael smiled softly. "That was the whole point, Dad. I didn't want you to feel like you were being sent away. I wanted you to know that you'll always have a home with me." David reached across the table and squeezed his son's hand. "I do, son, and I couldn't be more grateful." They ate breakfast together, talking about old memories, sharing laughter, and enjoying the simple joy of being with each other. After breakfast, Michael grabbed his car keys. "Ready for that trip to the park?" he asked. David's face lit up. "Absolutely." A short drive later, they arrived at the park. It was just as David remembered: tall trees, a small pond, and children running around, their laughter filling the air. As he walked along the path with Michael beside him, he saw the same wooden bench where he used to sit when Michael was a little boy. He stopped and patted the bench. "You remember this spot?" he asked. Michael grinned. "Of course. This is where you used to bring me after school. We'd sit here, eat ice cream, and you'd tell me stories about your childhood." David chuckled. "And you always asked for one more story." Michael laughed. "I still love your stories, Dad." They sat on the bench together, watching the world go by. Birds chirped, the wind was cool, and everything felt right. David turned to his son. "I was so afraid, Michael. Afraid of being alone. Afraid of losing everything. But you showed me that I had nothing to fear." Michael looked at him with love in his eyes. "You'll never be alone, Dad. I promise." David took a deep breath, feeling the crisp air fill his lungs. He had spent so many days worrying about the future, but now, sitting beside his son, he realized something important.